This is today's business leaders. Actionable advice from real-world professionals. And now here's your host, Gabe Arnold.
All right, today I have back on the show with me, Jeet Banerjee, and we had such a blast last time and actually also got to hang out and meet in person in LA a few weeks ago that I wanted to have him back on and just get an update on where he's at and also chat about some of the things we didn't have time to cover last week. So welcome back to the show, Jeet.
Yeah, thanks so much for having me. Excited to be here.
Yeah, absolutely. So it was awesome, and I always enjoy this. It's awesome to actually sit face to face with people that you've met virtually before. So it was a lot of fun to sit down and have dinner and hang out, a few weeks ago and just kind of get to know you more. And there was a couple things that stood out to me from the conversation that we had. One was you said your greatest gift and your greatest weakness is that you're super impatient, which I really identify with because I always like to launch things long before I should ever even consider launching them. That really made a lot of sense. And then I also was honestly just really impressed of the number of things that you've tried, all the things you've tested. You've had a lot of success, obviously, and you've had failures too. And I think for me, sometimes it's really valuable to dig into the failures more and learn more about those, because those there's two ideals out of that for me. Ideally, somebody listening, can learn from that and shortcut it completely, which is the perfect world that I like to aim for. But then the second piece is sometimes I feel like it's really helpful to share the things that we did wrong, because then it gives people hope that are also out there doing things wrong. Because I think I mentioned to you, I think I told you this when we were hanging out, I'm I've had 250 ideas and only 5 are good. So you mentioned something about one, and I thought maybe you could share us a little bit more about this to start. You talked about how you spent a year and $50,000 launching a business. But then it didn't really work out. So let's dive into that and just share kind of how you got there. Maybe, and actually share the context of how you had 50 grand to invest. Because to be honest, I've always just bootstrapped my ideas. I guess down the road, I eventually put that much in, but I never said, oh, I'm going to start and just throw cash into a business, because I didn't have it, not because it's a right or wrong way to do it. But give us some context, and then let's kind of dive into that and learn about, what you learned and what you would tell other people to do or not do from the experience you had.
Yeah, absolutely. So I had this idea for this company when I was about 21. And at 21, being as young as I was, it was kind of like a blessing and a curse, but I had a good amount of success leading up to that point. So I had about 4 or 5 companies that I'd already launched and that were doing well and generating revenue. And it's pretty rare sometimes to have your first handful of companies be successful or generate revenue, right? So yeah. I was very lucky, and I was kind of riding a cloud, a high of being successful and achieving all this stuff. And I just sold a company prior to starting this one. So I had a good amount of cash, and I just felt really kind of cocky and arrogant. And I was like, man, anything I touch, I can make it happen. I can make it work, right? So I'm riding this cloud. So at that point, prior to this, my brain and everything that I always did was oh, I got to bootstrap. Let's keep it as small and scale out once we make things work. But on this one, I was like, nah, I don't need to do all that. I've been hitting it with all these other ideas. So every idea I must have must be gold. So pretty much what it was I had this concept for an idea that would basically help musicians, like indie artists and people that are just kind of starting out as a musician, be able to kind of promote their own brands and promote themselves by incentivizing their fans to kind of share their music and all this kind of stuff. So I had this whole idea for creating this platform, but there was 2 big problems with this. One, I had no idea about the music industry. I was just a fan that would listen to music, but I had knew nothing about the inner workings of it. Mm-hmm. And number 2, I didn't even really know any musicians that came out to me and told me, hey, this is a problem. So that was the 2 biggest mistakes that I made just going into it, but I didn't really consider it or think about it. I was like, man, this seems like gold. Let's just do it. So I kind of ran through the idea. And early on when I started, I always had this major fear of people taking my ideas. So I'd be super secretive about it, getting people to sign NDAs. And the first thing I always wanted to do was go out and get a patent. So for those of you that may not know that, patents are not cheap. So just on the patent alone, I spent about $12,000 just getting this patent out of the ground, and then just building the website platform and setting up the business entities and all that kind of stuff and those little things. After about a year, we were at about $50,000. And when we kind of finally launched the company and kind of started pushing it out towards musicians and stuff like that, I remember a bunch of musicians kind of came back to us, and they were like, the platform's cool, but we don't really need this. Like, we're good. We're good with social media and we're good with what we have. And that was like the biggest moment of like failure and like kind of like disappointment, where it was like, man, like I really didn't know what I was doing here, and I really just screwed up epically here. And so it was a great learning lesson because it taught me two things. It taught me one thing, which was never shortcut my way towards building a business, because that was the first time I shortcutted it, and boom, it backfired like crazy. So I always knew, no matter how big I may get or no matter how much success I may have for my next project, anytime you're starting a company from scratch, humble yourself down to the bottom and do the process that worked the first few times and kind of stick to it. Start small, bootstrap, and really test and validate your ideas, survey people, and figure out if there is actually need or a fit for the idea that you're trying to create. So that was kind of like the first lesson that I learned. And then the second lesson that I kind of learned also, which was big for me, being as young as I was just to kind of slow down and just to kind of approach things more methodically rather than just kind of being very emotional or irrational and just doing that. So yeah, got a lot of takeaways from that $50,000 failure.
And I forget, did you go all the way through college and graduate or no?
No, I was there for about 4 semesters, and then I just ended up dropping out and doing the entrepreneur thing full time.
Okay. So you ended up paying for your education with this project. No, I just tease it because I'm not super academic, but I always tell people I've paid more than you've ever paid for your college. With all the dumb things I've tried to do.
Yeah.
Yeah, I think that's a really good lesson and good advice, and I appreciate you sharing it, because anytime that we shortcut what works, then we have a high potential for failure. And so if we back up to things that did work, what have you always done? Because in this case, you had the opportunity and the money to throw into it, and you initially thought that was a good idea, and obviously you learned it wasn't. But from what we talked about, I mean, you could invest money in your next business. I mean, you've very successfully launched multiple businesses, sold a couple of them. I mean, you figured it out at a very young age, honestly. But even with all of that success behind you, are you still going to bootstrap the next idea, or what does that look like doing it right?
Yeah, absolutely. So for me, one of the earliest books that I kind of had recommended to me by a mentor when I first started my entrepreneurial journey was this book called The Lean Startup by Eric Ries. And I think it's like a phenomenal book because it kind of teaches you how to, no matter how successful you may be or how much money you may have, how to really just create your idea in the simplest form and the fastest way to see if it's a viable idea or not. And I think that's been like the biggest thing that I've done throughout. And I think that's worked for me in the past. And I like to say, if it's not broke, don't fix it. So I'm just kind of planning on sticking to that route. And just really like bootstrapping as much as possible, but maybe not to the extent that I would bootstrap initially. Like when I first started out and I had no money, I would like literally have no business entity. So I'd kind of be like operating illegally, so to speak, right?
Yeah.
I would have no business entities. I would like go out and hustle for like any service or anything I need, like just giving out equity left and right. Like, here, I need someone to manage my social media stuff. Here's like 10% of my company, and like trying to like plug and play all those things. So I've kind of learned in terms of like when it comes to building the idea and validating it and all that stuff, I'm not trying to like invest thousands and thousands of dollars. Just launch fast, launch quick, get feedback and see if it works. But for a lot of the other things, whether it's like getting marketing services or getting a business entity, all those things, I do have the luxury where I could spend like, maybe like I would say like I could spend up to like, I'm comfortable spending about like up to like 5 or 10 grand to launch an idea now. And I think that's kind of where I'm at nowadays. Yeah.
That's cool. Yeah, that's good. And I appreciate you sharing the numbers too, because that gives people some context of bootstrapping to doing it that way. So on the music idea that failed, how long did you work on the idea until you actually launched it publicly? Was it
about like 4 or 5 months?
Okay. And I don't know if there's a difference. That's why I'm asking, like with your course that you're launched now, or with all the other things like your data company that you sold, how long did it take to launch those publicly facing, or is there an average or something?
Yeah, absolutely. So with like StatFuse, the college tool, that was about 6 months before we launched it. And then for my course now, it was something that I was kind of just doing like on the side because there's a lot of material, a lot of stuff to record. That one might be about like a year and a couple months before I actually like had everything together for it. Yeah. So I think it just depends kind of on like what I'm doing at the time and also kind of just how intensive the process is. For a lot of some of the other websites and stuff, it was more like coding intensive. So my developers kind of were held more accountable for time purposes. But for the course in the academy, it was pretty much like a 95% workload on me. So that one took a little bit longer to put together.
Because I've always been curious if like speed of launch matters or if it's actually like speed of getting real user feedback. And I know that sounds like the same thing, but it probably isn't, right?
Yeah, no, 100%. I think for me, it's always been speed of user feedback. So like long before when we consider like the launching period, like for the first month or two, we're just going out and trying to like survey people, talk to people that we think would be the ideal customer, so to speak, and just getting feedback from them, seeing if this is a problem, seeing if this is something that they relate to, and seeing how we can kind of better the idea before we ever really launch anything and push it out to market.
Oh, cool. Okay, that makes sense. How do you get to a quantitative state where, so you can use any example from your successes that you think would be helpful to share, but how do you know when you've had enough interviews, or how do you know when you've uncovered enough, or like walk me through like how you think through that market research period? Because that sounds like how you're validating the idea, right?
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, so it's very dependent on each idea, but the one thing I like to tell people, and like it never makes any sense when I tell them this on the spot, but when they go out and they do it, they're like, ah, and it's you'll just know. So like for example, with like the college tool, we went out and we like, because we were still like in graduating high school and all that stuff, so we had a ton of people that we knew that were in high school. So we just went up to like a bunch of seniors like after school and just started talking to them, and we're like, hey, like, are you struggling with college applications? Like, how's the college process going for you? And we may have talked to maybe like 100 to 150 students, but we got like 150 yeses out of the 150 people we talked to. And at that point, it was like, okay, we know this is a problem. Like, we don't need to go any further. And then
Okay.
there'll be some times where, like for some other companies, for example, where I've had like I've gone out and talked to people and I've gotten like 50 no's. And then it's like, whoa, hold on, let's take a step back. Like, why is everyone saying this isn't a problem? And then either one of two things happens. Either the ideal customer that I thought was a customer for this is not the customer, or the idea just sucks. So then we got to go and reiterate and figure out what it is. So I think it becomes like clearly evident. And like, if something's a problem, like you should be looking at like 90 to 95% of the ideal audience saying, yes, this is a problem. And yes, I want a solution for it.
That's good. Yeah. So you're looking for like total confirmation as much as possible, like because that way the idea is strong. You mentioned something interesting. You said, which I totally agree with you. Like, you're either talking to somebody who's not your ideal customer, or the idea sucks. Which we've all had plenty of bad ideas. Has there been a time where you've just been talking to the wrong person, and then you realize that you're supposed to talk to a different party, and the idea was good?
Yeah, absolutely. So for some of the mobile apps that I've done in the past, we used to create some gaming apps and we try to like kind of validate those ideas. So like, for example, like an app that I thought, like a gaming app that I thought would be like a great hit with like maybe like teenagers or just like preteens. And we'd go out and talk to these teenagers and these preteens, and like they'd make these faces and they'd be like, I don't want to play that. That's like disgusting. Like, what are you talking about? And we'd be like, oh man, like we got this all wrong. And then just out of like coincidence, like I'd tell my friends about the results or something, and then like they would look at the app and they'd be like, man, that's an awesome idea. Like I'd totally mess around with that. And I'm like, oh man, maybe I'm like 10 years too young right now. Let's go survey those people. And boom, all of a sudden you find out that like 20+ year old people are all about playing this like mobile game while they're waiting at the doctor's office or something. But the teenagers and preteens do not relate to it whatsoever. So yeah, sometimes you just kind of find out by accident. And sometimes like what you think is a perfect game for somebody or whatnot is just completely, totally off.
That's pretty interesting. And then, so that, it sounds like because you're willing to get out there and ask questions and like just give exposure to the idea, that really helps you guide like your process. Would you say that's accurate?
Yeah, 100%. Yeah.
Has there been a time where it was just a bad idea and you tried to pivot or talk to a different audience and it was just a bad idea?
Yeah, definitely. I've had a handful of those, like multiple times where I've just had an idea. I go talk to like one audience, that audience doesn't work. Then I go try like 5 or 6 other audiences. And I'm just like, after maybe like a couple of weeks of time wasted, I'm like, okay, I'm looking at 2,000 no's in like 5 years. Like, we're probably not on the right foot here. So yeah, no, absolutely.
How do you do a lot of that face to face now? Like, like obviously when you're in high school, it's pretty easy to do a lot of face-to-face interaction with your audience in that type of niche. But now, how do you recommend that people go have those conversations? And what do you think is like, I know if you got 50 or 60 yeses as already, you probably have that certainty that you're looking for. But when it's more varied, is there kind of like a benchmark rule of thumb number of how many people you're trying to talk to, and how do you specifically talk to them? Break that down.
Yeah, absolutely. So when it comes to collecting the data itself, nowadays, like there's so many different ways, and I think it's about like finding the fastest, cheapest, and most efficient way to gather that data. Like I've had like various hacks that I've used. Like for example, sometimes I'll like email like a professor at a university, right? Because I'm like, okay, this professor's got a class of like 100 students that are my ideal customers, and just I email them, tell them like, hey, I'm creating this company, I'm trying to do this project. I'd be extremely thankful if you could like pass out this piece of paper or like put this survey on the board and get me the results. Take you like 5 minutes, and oftentimes they'll be like, yeah, absolutely, anything to help like entrepreneurship or whatever, right? And they just do it for free, and boom, in like less than a day I've got 100 people that just answered a couple questions for me, right? So like I just try to find like different hacks, and it just depends on who my audience is and where I can find them. And the biggest thing is you have to find a place where your audience is most approachable, right? So if you find out that like your audience is like someone that's like a 9-to-5 employee, for example, that's disgruntled, I don't want to go to their disgruntled workplace and ask them those questions, right? Because it's not going to go too well from multiple standpoints, but you got to figure out where else they could be at and where they're approachable. And I just look for different places that they're approachable, and just find like, you might find like, all right, there's 3 different places that they're approachable. Now, place B is the easiest to collect that data or to get that information. So sometimes it's digital, sometimes it's like in person, sometimes I'll send somebody to go do it. Like I'll send like one of my brother's friends or something and pay him like $10 an hour and be like, yo, go do this for the rest of the day and get me all this data, right?
Nice.
So yeah, so that's kind of how we collect the data. And then when it comes to like kind of assessing and analyzing the data, usually when you get like, so the biggest thing I like to do is I don't like to keep the data, like questions open-ended. Because if you give people too many choices, then your data is going to be all messed up. It's going to be all jumbled up. So I love to keep it as like yes or no, or like option A or option B, option A or option B. And pretty much from there, you can really get like a definitive set of data that you can collect. And then if you go through it and you're like, okay, I got 50% yes and 50% no, then you got to try and figure out what kind of people are giving you those no's, right? So maybe try to dig deeper and see, okay, who are the people that gave me a no versus who are the people that gave me a yes? Is there a significant difference between these two people? And the greatest thing about doing this stuff in the customer identification period is that if you figure all this stuff out, then when you launch your company, it becomes so easy, because when you need to spend marketing dollars or go out and market, you know exactly who to market to.
Mm-hmm.
So when it comes to like figuring out the numbers and stuff, like if you're kind of 50-50, I always look at that as like a red flag. And I tell people that like, you've got to get even deeper, because the biggest thing that many people like to tell me, or like if you ask someone like, hey, who's your ideal customer? This is the number one answer I hear. Everyone is not your customer, right? And that's the answer that I hate to hear. And people really think that they could sell something to 7 billion people. But the beauty of entrepreneurship and business is if you sell something really good to 10,000 people, you're going to be killing it. And you have no idea how much you're going to be killing it, right?
Yeah.
So I really try to like isolate my target audience and customer as much as possible. And for people that may be like 50-50, 60-40, stuff like that, they may just be too broad on their customer profile, and they need to like get more targeted to really figure out who it is.
Yeah, that's a great advice. And I totally agree with you too. One of my best products, I have 150 customers on. It's
Yeah,
not,
exactly.
it's not like, I mean, do I want a billion customers on it? Sure. But it's like, I'm good. Like I got
Yeah.
150 customers, 1,000, somebody will consider buying you pretty, like you're all of a sudden, acquirable. 10,000,
Yeah.
you hit a home run, I think.
Yeah, absolutely.
Yeah, that's cool. I think this is really important, and I think that people don't always get into the details. So let's dive a little bit deeper. You mentioned like you're concerned when you get a 50-50 split that that the customer profile isn't specific enough. Do you have like a specific case or story of when that happened where you could break down the details and what you did with it, or can you dig into that a little bit more?
Yeah, absolutely. So with StatViews, pretty much what we did there was we were a college tool that helps students with their college application. So we would calculate their odds of admission, and we would basically look at the college application, tell them strengths and weaknesses, and basically serve as a virtual counselor to high school students. And what was crazy was that, like ask a general person who is our ideal audience, they're going to say, oh, any high school student. But
Mm-hmm.
that was not the case, right? We got so in depth that we could tell you what our ideal customer would be doing on a Friday night. So in high school, you got like a couple different types of students and what they would be doing on a Friday night, right? Some might be partying, some might be going to the football game, etc. Our kid was the one that was at home, probably studying or probably preparing for like the next week or reading up or doing something very low key and very calm. Like the top 10% of students in their class, in their school, Ivy League candidates, top UC candidates, and we could give you like a complete breakdown and all this data and all this information about the ideal customer and the absolutely wrong customer on the same token. And I think it's really important if you can identify who your customers are not just as much as you can identify who they are, because then there leaves like very little room for error in between. And so, with StatFuse, like initially we came out and we were like, oh yeah, we're for all high school students when we first launched. And we just started pushing this out to all high school students. And some of the high school students would be like, I don't care. I don't need this. I don't care. Like college, I don't care about that right now. Right. And then it was like, whoa, like let's take a step back here real quick and figure out who's like the ideal person for this, and just keep digging and just trying to isolate and target different people, right? And most of the time it's pretty obvious. Like if you were to ask someone like, okay, it's not any high school student, what kind of high school student it is, most people are gonna be like, all right, it's the top performing high school students that really care about their education. So yeah.
That's a perfect example. Thank you. How have you developed those listening skills or that intuition to know that when that popped up to dig deeper and make those changes? I mean, you have a really highly developed sense of customer profiles and ideal customers, and honestly, especially for your age, which I think we'll touch on later. But how did you become such a good listener and observer? Because I think those are like two really strong suits of yours.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, definitely. I think for me, it's always been one of those things where I've been super, super competitive. And one of the best, like growing up and everything like that, like I had to win at everything that I did. And every time I would lose, I would try to study and learn and look at the person that won or the person that was like the best at what they did. And I would always observe like, what's this little thing they're doing? What's that little thing they're doing? And I even do that like nowadays, like when playing video games, for example, right? Like fairly play, but like my friends will come over and we'll run like some Madden or some football video game, whatever it is, and I'll lose. And then the next game, like I got to pass the controller on to the next buddy. And the person that beat me, I'm watching everything that they're doing so closely without them knowing, so that the next time I play them, I know to be able to beat them. And I think it's just come from that competitive nature where I've just learned that like to beat the best, you got to know what the best does and you got to be able to compete with them. And one of my favorite quotes is like, I think it's like a Big Sean line, and it's about how like, turning your idols into your rivals. And like, that's kind of how I've always looked at things.
I like that.
Yeah.
That's cool, man. Yeah, it's very apparent. You're very deep, and when I ask you something, you have a reason, and like you've thought it out and figured it out, and I appreciate that about you.
Thank you.
What's your like ideal day look like, or what's your daily structure like? Are you somebody that's super rigid and have something you do, you wake up early, do all that stuff, or are you more kind of organic and kind of observe and float around along in the sense, and then just adjust based on what comes up? How would you describe your mode of operation?
I think my preferred mode of operation is kind of like that organic, just kind of go with the flow and stuff like that. But sometimes it's hard to do because like everyone's trying to like schedule me in here, schedule this in here and all that kind of stuff. So I've kind of learned to kind of grow into kind of being schedule driven and all that kind of stuff. But my ideal day is usually just like kind of waking up fairly early in the morning, just kind of getting to work. And pretty much my work days, man, they take me so many different places, so many different days. Like, that's the crazy thing about being an entrepreneur. I feel like I never have like one set schedule or one set day that goes for me. Like sometimes I may need to work till 1 a.m. and other days I might be like at 2 p.m. I'm like, man, I got nothing else to do today. So, it's kind of crazy when it comes to that. So I don't have like any fixed schedule or anything. The couple things I do like to do though are I like to like midday, I love to go to the gym. Just kind of like take my brain out of things and just like get the adrenaline pumping and just go to the gym for an hour or so. And I think that does like wonders for me, because I avoid being burned out and stuff like that. And then towards like the evening or nighttime, I do like to like either spend some time with friends or family, play video games, like do something else to kind of take my mind off and kind of like rest myself. But other than that, yeah, it's fairly my schedule is all over the place, like very hard to give you like what happens in one exact day.
I've for short seasons been able to have like a really rigid structure, and I just can never figure it out. So I'm totally back to, it's pretty similar. Like some days I'm up late because I'm doing a webinar or doing something or whatever, and I may not start my day till 10 in the morning. And then other times I get up at 6 or 7, or I used to get up really early, like at 3:30 or 4, which I love, but I can't sustain with the way everything else happens now because I have too late of things in the day. But it's definitely, for me, I've just until very recently, probably in the last 6 months, I've always honestly had a little bit of guilt or frustration about the fact that I couldn't keep like a consistent schedule. And then somebody, a time management coach that actually started this show with me last fall, pointed out to me, she's like, you're doing fine. You're like hitting your objectives. You get things done in your way, in your time. And she's like, that's just the way you operate. Like, she's like, you don't need to try to have somebody else's schedule or do it like somebody else you follow. And that was really freeing, because I was like, oh, it's cool. Like, this is how I do it. And so I kind of coined the phrase that I just, always have creative chaos going on. So.
Yeah, no, I totally relate with that. Like, even if you look at my to-do list, like I've got like 58 things on my to-do list, and that's like a low ball too. Like, I probably got more than that. And it's just like crazy because like I don't follow like any structure. It's not like the first thing I put on my to-do list is the first thing I do. It's just like I look at the 58 things and I'm like, which one's the thing I really need to do right now? And then it just goes from there, and it's just all over the place. But yeah, same thing. Things seem to get done, so I haven't had like a need to really change it.
Yeah, no, it's definitely interesting, but it was kind of freeing, and I wanted to share that, it was nice hearing that that's kind of your mode of operation, because it was really freeing for me to hear, like, you don't have to do it like everybody else. That's the whole point of being an entrepreneur. And I felt kind of silly when she said that to me, because I was like, oh yeah, I'm an entrepreneur. But it was really nice to have somebody else kind of validate that it's like, just do your thing. And like, as long as you're being productive and hitting goals overall and like it works out, then do it in your own method. Don't think you have to work the list top to bottom, like you just said. Just like, pick whatever you think you should do and do it. So I'm glad I'm not the only one. The other thing I thought we'd dive into a little bit, because I think that needs to be more conversation around this, and I don't know if I'm the one well equipped to lead the conversation, but I'm going to ask you anyway. But is that I think that I'll be 36 this fall. You're 25. We've got 10 years between us, but I feel like you operate like you're in your 30s, but you're technically a millennial, I think, anyway. I'm not always so good with all the generations, but you're definitely in the millennial space. And I see two patterns in your space. There's in your generation. And I think that sometimes people older than me don't have a clear view and can be judgmental. And I think that's normal for any generations. Like, the kids always say those old people don't know what they're doing, and the old people say the kids don't know what they're doing.
Yeah.
Neither is true and neither is wrong. But so like, I think you fall into like of 1 to 5% of people, and especially millennials, where you've done the work, you're very successful, you've sold companies, and so you act like it. And I mean that like in a good way, because you authentically act the way you are. You know what you're talking about. Like, just the first half of the conversation we've had here, things about running businesses that I have no idea about, and I'm learning from you. And so you walk the walk, so you can talk the talk, because you've done it. And so, like, a guy I had on my show last week, Scott, he's your age too, and same thing, like, he super gets it. And like, the millennials I have on my show, I choose for a reason. They're the ones that I think are leading the pack and setting the example and doing it right. And then there's a lot of, and this is just my feeling, I'm not a millennial, and this is kind of what I want you to speak to, or maybe we can talk through, is a lot of millennials, like the other 95%, and I think that's a normal percentage across any generation when it comes to entrepreneurship and doing things right. But the other 95% rent the nice cars, flaunt it on social media like they have made it. And then when you sit down and have a conversation with them, they clearly have no idea what they're doing. And do you think this is just normal and it's going to happen over and over, or is there something different going on in your generation, I guess is my question. I'm not being really clear, but that's
man, I think in our generation, there is something a little bit different. And what I've kind of identified that to be, because I kind of look at like my younger brother, who's like a lot younger than me, right? He's like 12, turning 13. And I look at like his mindset and his mentality, and I'll kind of touch on that a little bit later. But in terms of, I think social media and just like media, digital media in general, has in a way kind of like corrupted them and their like thought process. because like, you know, you look at like the new and upcoming like rappers and artists and actors and all these like influential people,
Mm-hmm.
and they all portray this type of success that our generation and all these millennials think is the only or the correct way to be successful. And it isn't about like personally, like for me, it's like I want to leave an impact bigger than my life when it's all said and done. That to me
Mm-hmm.
is success. Like I don't care if I have a Lamborghini parked in the driveway or not. To me, it's like if I'm gone, did I do something that created more value that's going to outlive me, right? But I
Yeah.
think a lot of people have in my generation have this mentality that like you need to have that Lamborghini parked outside your car. You need to be wearing that Gucci hat to have that level of success, and they feel like they need to prove that they're successful, so they go above and beyond to spend every last dime they have on these materialistic things, so to speak, and then they flaunt about it on social media. And I think I don't know if they're fully to blame, because I think there's a lot of like bad perceptions that are given out by influential people that are personal brands and personal figures and things of that nature. And I think that has kind of caused this kind of like craziness that you're kind of referring to, because I've definitely seen it myself. And even like just looking at my brother, for example, like my brother will always ask me like, oh, what name brand did you buy today? Like, do you got Louis? Do you got Gucci? Do you have this? Do you have that? And I'm just like, no. And he's like, well, I want Louis, I want Gucci, I want Jordan, I want this, I want that. And I'm like, you know, you're just a walking advertisement for these brands. Like when you want the shirt that just says Gucci right on it, you know, you're just like helping them make more and more money. And he's like, nah, Gucci's the coolest. This rapper said so, and blah, blah, blah. And I'm just like, okay, like I totally get it. So yeah, that's kind of how I feel about it though.
That's a good perspective. Yeah. And it's interesting because like I grew up pre-internet and you probably grew up like early internet, right?
Mm-hmm.
So
Yeah.
we didn't have social media either way. We weren't born with it in our hand. And you're right. Like, I was talking to my sister-in-law over the weekend and I'm like, she's got the most beautiful little girl, my niece. And my niece was up, you know, she's like 3 or 4 months old. She's not that old. So she was like upset and crying. And I'm like, where's my Instagram, baby? And because on Instagram, my sister-in-law posts the most beautiful pictures. And she said something really, really insightful to me. And she always does this. She's super smart. She's like, I always tell people only post what you want them to see. And I was like, that's a pretty concise way of saying it. It cracked me up. And I think you're right. I think it's easy to, and I think this applies to everybody, no matter what age you are. I think it's easy to take at face value what you see people flaunting or putting out there.
Mm-hmm.
And if you don't have any relationship with them, or you've never hung around them, or you don't know what they're really about, or you don't actually follow their true actions, then it's easy to think that's what they are. And that can work both ways, positively and negatively. There's some people that come off kind of rough and tough, and you're like, you know, that person's being a dick and I don't want to follow them.
Yeah.
But they may actually be more valuable than the person that's always, you know, taking pictures of the car they rented. So
Yeah, 100%.
so yeah, it's just something, you know, interesting that I think a lot about, because I don't know the thing that and this is just what I see, and I think it comes from all age groups in my feed, because I hang out with a lot of entrepreneurs and marketers. And there's always talk about like, oh, I launched $1 million funnel, or I just did this launch and made 50 grand today. And there's all these like dollar statements about like revenue. And nobody talks about, are you profitable? Is this a repeatable process? Are you making an impact on the world? Like you said, I mean, we're totally on the same page on that. That's what I want to do. I want to leave an impact. It's like, will I have nice things over time? Sure. Like there's nothing wrong with that, but that's not the actual driver. What I would, in a sense, that's not what I would promote to people as my definition of success, like you said. And it's so easy to get focused on the wrong things when that's all that people talk about, you know. And your example of your little brother is pretty interesting.
Yeah.
So I just always think it's worth like considering what conversation is going on all around us and seeing if it's accurate or important or what should be focused on. And it's since reading, it's not a direct tie-in, but it kind of has some parallels. Since reading this book called The Snowball about Warren Buffett, like I learned more about him. And I've heard this quote before, but it stood out to me a lot more learning his life story. And he's always like, when everybody's greedy, be scared. And when everybody's scared, be greedy. And it was like his way of saying, like, do the opposite of what's out there and you'll probably be okay.
Yeah, absolutely. I've heard that one for sure. Love that one.
Yeah. And it's just a great reminder.
Mm-hmm.
Cool. So I really appreciate it, man. You always have such amazing value, to offer and share. And I really respect you and appreciate you. I think you're doing really good things in the marketplace and you're somebody that I trust a lot. So I appreciate that you're willing to invest time here with me and everybody on the show.
Yeah, absolutely. No, I definitely appreciate it. It's always so much fun being on here with you guys.
Cool. So there's a couple things we'll put in the show notes, but you guys can check out a project that Jeet has been working on, and I've actually been hanging out and helping a little bit too. The incomeincubator.com is a course where he teaches you everything that he's learned over the years. And what I love about it is it's authentically, he figured these things out. He didn't can somebody else's course and assume it worked and gave it to you. These are all businesses that he's built. So I definitely recommend that you check that out. And then, of course, you can follow him on his personal page and see what he's up to there at jeetbanerjee.com. But we'll put that in the show notes. Is there anything else that you want to share or anything else you want people to connect on with you before we go here?
No, yeah, my personal website's good. Got my blog, got my social media profiles, all that good stuff. So, yeah.
Cool.
It'd be good to go.
All right. I appreciate it, man. Thanks for being on.
Yeah, my pleasure. Thanks so much.
You've been listening to Today's Business Leaders with Gabe Arnold. Remember to subscribe on iTunes. For more information, visit todaysbusinessleaders.com.